کنفرانس در واشنگتن. سیاست آمریکا در خاورمیانه و ایران، حفاظت از اشرف. 2 ژوئن 2011، 12 خرداد 1390.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to see a number of you that I had the opportunity to interact with while at the State Department, and pleased to join this distinguished panel. And I would argue fundamentally that the best way to affect change in Iran is to continue to support very aggressively, very vocally, and very concretely the remarkable change that is occurring across the region. In essence, answer a question that ultimately must be posed to the leadership in Tehran. If in Tahrir Square, why not in Tehran? And I actually am cautiously optimistic that change is inevitable. The change that we're seeing in the Middle East cannot be reversed. The Middle East cannot go back to where it was. Now, that's not to say that change is inevitable. We're obviously already seeing a counter-revolution, if you will. What we're seeing in the Middle East is a revolution, but it also involves evolutions, if you will, that obviously the governments in Tunisia and Egypt were caught by surprise. But in Syria, in Bahrain, in Tehran, even in China, they're not being caught by surprise. They're now responding aggressively to what they're seeing, and ultimately the best policy that the United States and the national community can have is to do whatever it takes to promote the kind of change that we want to see in the Middle East, and ultimately, whether it's sooner, we hope, that change will inevitably come to Tehran as well, because Tehran is not immune to what we're seeing going on in Tahrir Square. But inevitably, with the reality of the 21st century, the connectivity that people have, the connectivity that we did see in the 2009 election in Iran that was stolen from the people of Iran, the power of the young people, many of you who are here today, these are the agents of change. They cannot be denied. They can be delayed, but they cannot be denied. Now, when you look at what's happening in the Middle East right now, obviously we will see new governments in Tunisia and Egypt. They will not be perfect. And I think as we look for historical parallels, I'm approaching my 60th birthday, so in my lifetime, among the seminal events, obviously was the events between 1989 and 1991, and I do think there are some important parallels. Now, what should U.S. policy be, going forward? I just left the administration 2 months ago. I was standing at a podium much like this as the events were happening in Tunisia and Egypt and beginning in Libya at the time I left. Obviously, the United States was cautious, and there's been some criticism of the administration's caution, both in the context of Egypt, but also going back a couple of years in the context of Iran. It is the policy of the United States of America to see a different kind of government, a more constructive and responsible actor in the region in Iran. The question is not if, the question is when and how to effect that change. And what we've seen since then is the steady delegitimization of the regime in Tehran and a fundamental shift even in Moscow and in Beijing to attitudes towards Tehran. Now, as Stu pointed out, some of these countries are problematic in terms of full implementation of sanctions and keeping the kind of pressure on the Tehran regime that is necessary, but let there be no doubt we are seeing both on the political side, on the economic side, certainly within Iran itself, fissures that have developed. They are visible. We see them regularly in the current tussle that exists between President Ahmadinejad and those who are opposing him. The President said the other day in his speech that it is the policy of the United States to support those who are reformers in the region. We have to make sure that we are translating that political commitment into real action and also, real resources. We have militarily intervened in Libya. We are demonstrating assertively to those who are resisting change that the international community is prepared to take aggressive action when necessary to protect civilians, but more importantly to preserve forces of reform for fundamental change where power transfers from the autocrats that have been in power for 30 or 40 years, to the people. That is our policy. How can we best do that? I think that while we have been cautious, and understandably so up to this point, it is now time for the United States to more assertively embrace publicly as well as privately and through concrete action and the commitment of real resources to the administration, to the United States policy to promote change that will start in places like Tunis and Cairo and inevitably arrive in Tehran as well. I would like to see the administration recognize that, President Assad is not a reformer. He could very well be a tool of those who are resisting change. Assad is not going to reform. Assad has to go. If Gaddafi has lost his legitimacy, so has President Assad. We're not going to go back to where it was. Now, Stu and others have outlined that there are risks involved here. Absolutely. There are unknowns involved here. Absolutely. But if the region is going to change, while we, the United States, cannot control this change, I think we have to give credit to the region. These are indigenous movements. Change is going to occur from the bottom up. It's not going to be imposed from the outside in. But we have to be in a position where we can help shape change and support people and institutions that can bring democratic governance, to the region as a whole, including to Tehran. Now, options with respect to Iran have to be on the table, but we have to make sure that there are as many non-military options available to the President and the Secretaries of State and Secretaries of Defense as possible. So we have to make sure that we actually have not only the right strategy, but we have to have the tools and the resources available, whether they're economic, political, social, democratic. And this is the message that we need to say to Congress. Congress has a vitally important role to play, and Congress showed last year the very important role that it played in passing national sanctions to augment the UN Security Council resolution that has put real pressure on Iran and has, as Stu said, raised the cost of Iran doing business. But we have to make sure that we continue for as long as it takes. We have to show the same kind of commitment at this opportunity for fundamental change in the Middle East, the same kind of determination and commitment that we showed throughout the Cold War, an effort that we ultimately were successful in. I think we can have the same success in helping the Middle East transform, including fundamental change in Tehran, but we have to continue to show the same kind of commitment that we did over the past half century. Thank you very much.
My history with Iran begins a quite long time ago when I was President Carter's chief domestic advisor in the White House, and we had the November '79 hostage-taking and the Iranian Revolution, which immediately preceded it, creating the first radical Islamic State dedicated and supportive of terror. This has caused one of the most profound geopolitical changes in our era, one we have lived with now for over 30 years. It's involved 4 sets of UN sanctions over Iran's nuclear program, with the latest discovery only a week or two ago by the IAEA of their development of triggers, whose only use is a military application. They've developed medium and longer range missiles, which threaten not only our allies throughout the region, but also as far as the eastern parts of Europe. They're the leading state supporter of terrorist groups, which threaten the Middle East peace process, the future direction of a Palestinian state, and the unity of Lebanon. I was involved in the initial freezing of Iranian assets after the hostage-taking. During the Clinton administration, as Undersecretary of State, I negotiated with the European Union on the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, and which led to a strengthening of EU dual-use exports to Iran, and was also very much involved with Secretary Albright in developing what we then call the Dialogue of Civilizations and the unilateral allowance of certain Iranian products like pistachios into the United States in the forlorn hope that it would improve relations with a relative moderate as president at the time, Khatami. Unfortunately, it did not. In private life, I'm now co-chairing for the Atlantic Council on Iran Task Force with Senator Chuck Hagel. We've been examining security threats, internal developments, sanctions, the nuclear developments, and others. I want to talk about a couple of topics dealing with the Iranian dimension of the Arab Spring and what it means for the balance of power in the region. Iran is determined to be a regional hegemon, and one of the reasons behind its nuclear power is its desire to be the top regional country or any other. Now, if you look at the Arab Spring from Iran's standpoint, they could see certain positive developments. For example, the turmoil in the region has allowed its nuclear program to proceed under the radar screen as the U.S. and our allies are focused very much on how to deal with the new democratic forces that have been unleashed. It now appears that they are not only developing this nuclear trigger, but they have been able to overcome the Stuxnet worm, and their levels of uranium enrichment now exceed those before the attack. Egypt will normalize relations shortly with Iran. They've allowed Iranian warships to pass through the Suez Canal for the first time since 1979. Egypt will put less pressure on Iran's Hamas ally, indeed brokered an agreement between Hamas and Fatah, and probably put less pressure on Iran's nuclear program. The Hamas-Fatah deal, looked at from Iran's standpoint, will get their surrogate more deeply into the West Bank and potentially into the next government after the 2012 elections. The notorious Al-Quds force of the Revolutionary Guards is, as we speak, now in Syria, helping Bashar Assad suppress the opposition through both arms and sophisticated internet blockage, just as they did to their own opposition in Iran. And this puts Iran, for the first time, squarely in a neighboring state of Israel. The negatives, on the other hand, of the Arab Spring from Iran's standpoint, I think, potentially outweigh those that are positive. For one thing, in the most broad sense, it's discredited the entire Iran and al-Qaeda model of violent revolution. Their crackdown after their June 2009 presidential elections, and more recently during the 2011 Arab Spring, was an enormous variance with the democratic movements and stirrings in the Muslim world. There is indeed the most serious power struggle internally since 1979 between Ayatollah Khomeini and Ahmadinejad, with the president weakened. It's very difficult to see how this will play out, but it is relevant that with all of his rantings and all of the danger he himself provides, that Ahmadinejad did accept the agreement that was reached in Geneva for at least a first step to try to compromise on the enriched uranium issue, and was overruled by the Ayatollah. Another negative from Iran's standpoint of the Arab Spring is indeed the very unrest I mentioned in Syria. It has certainly threatened Assad, their key ally, and even if he survives, which is unclear, he clearly will do so in a weakened state and one in which he has much less legitimacy. It's quite interesting that Erdogan, the Prime Minister of Turkey, who's soon to be almost overwhelmingly re-elected, has been sharply critical of Assad. And indeed, I would posit to you that one of the reasons that Hamas agreed to the recent Hamas-Fatah deal that they rejected in 2009 was because of their fear that there will be a regime change in Damascus, their base, and that they will be thrown out of the country. In addition, while it is true that the democratic openings in Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere may create an avenue for the Muslim Brotherhood to assert itself in ways they couldn't when American allies, autocratic though they may be, were in power, it's also true that the Muslim Brotherhood has very few relationships with Iran. The Sunni-Shiite tension is very much there. Yet another negative from Iran's standpoint is that the Arab Spring has emboldened Saudi Arabia to take a stronger stand against Iran and try to get the Arab monarchies together, Jordan, Morocco, and the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, in an anti-Iranian posture. Indeed, it seems that if there is a model at the end of the day for the Arab Spring, one which recognizes, for better or for worse, that there will be more Muslim influence in the political process, it is probably Turkey, not Iran. Now, again, if one looks from the U.S. perspective at the regional balance of power, the neat lineup which existed before the Arab Spring of Egypt, Jordan, the Saudis, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries on one hand against Iran, Syria, and the terrorist groups they support on the other, this has clearly changed as if a deck of cards split evenly had been thrown up in the air, landing in unpredictable ways. Egypt is changing significantly, and we have to face that fact. There is more distance from the United States, more hostility to Israel, more championing of the Palestinian cause. The recent opening of the Rafah crossing is, along with the Hamas-Fatah pact, which they helped negotiate, clear evidence of that. That is not to say, indeed I would posit it will not be the case, that they will become an actual ally of Iran or that there will be an Islamic Republic of Egypt. Egypt is a very, very different country. But there will be a normalization of relations. The Muslim Brotherhood and the Military Council in Egypt have formed an informal alliance because I believe the military sees the Muslim Brotherhood as an ascendant force. They're likely to capture at least 30% of the vote in the September elections, and with splinter Muslim religious parties may hold close to a majority. Having said that, I do not believe in any way that Egypt is a lost cause. It simply will be a different country. We still have strong ties to the military. Over 50% of the senior officers of the Egyptian military were trained in the United States. They are the second largest recipient of U.S. military aid, and from their perspective, the largest recipient comes from the United States. And we still have strong trade and economic ties. With respect to the U.S. role, I believe it should be the following, and with this I'll conclude. We have lost unquestionably some influence as a result of the overturn of some of our closest allies. But we have by no means lost all influence, and I would still posit that we are the most influential of any non-Arab state. We have strong military facilities in Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain, and the UAE, and Oman. We have strong and indeed enhanced defense relationships with a huge $60 billion sale with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, as I mentioned. Our economic and political levers with Egypt are quite considerable. With respect to Iraq, it is important, I hope, that we will keep a residual military presence there to keep Iran from gaining more influence. The satirists are pressuring Prime Minister Maliki to not extend in any way our presence, with some 47,000 troops still there, and I hope that the Prime Minister can be persuaded that it is important that the U.S. continue to maintain a military presence in Iraq as a way of reducing Iranian influence. With respect to Afghanistan, it is also important that we continue to maintain a strong military presence. The surge obviously has ups and downs, but it has weakened the Taliban, and a negotiated settlement will be a much better one from our perspective if we can continue to put pressure on the Taliban and their allies in every way. With respect to Iran, as everyone on this panel has been stating, it is important to strengthen the democratic opposition. It is Iran which is the terrorist state. That's where the terrorism emanates. And that's where the focus should be. The State Department, it is going through their process as the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia required them to do. And I hope that as they do so, they will expedite their decision and that they will reflect on the fact that the UK and the EU, to which I was an ambassador, have both lifted their restrictions with respect to the MEK, but the State Department, I hope, will make their decision based on the merits and to do so quickly and promptly, again recognizing the precedents that others have created. It is important that we strengthen democratic forces not only in Iran but throughout the region. This is a critical inflection point in the history of this region. And it is incredibly important that we put every resource, including the G20 pledge of $20 billion, into Egypt and Tunisia, and to support the democratic forces there to make it clear that going in a more radical direction would be a subterfuge of the whole Arab Spring. What happens over the next 6 months will have meaning for decades to come, and we have to act with great alacrity. One last point. I've lived with sanctions and helped craft them during the Clinton administration. I called myself the sanctions meister during that 8-year period. There is no question that the 4 rounds of UN sanctions, together with the EU and US unilateral sanctions focused specifically on the financial sector in Iran are having an effect. They're raising the cost of the nuclear program. That, together with cyber warfare, defections, and assassinations of key scientists, have slowed but not stopped the program. There is a real economic cost. Western consumer companies are even withdrawing, even though they're not directly involved in sanctions. There's less investment in their energy area. It's very hard to insure a ship going into Iran. China is a problem, a real problem in the sanctions effort, but the sanctions are working. But it is not clear that with this regime, sanctions will be enough. It is unacceptable for this regime to have either nuclear weapons or a nuclear weapons capability. Therefore, when we talk about every option being on the table, we need to mean that every option is on the table. Thank you very much.
All of your activities here demonstrate how much the American people care about Iran. It's one of the biggest foreign policy challenges that we face, and this morning you'll hear a range of views of how we ought to approach it, but every single one of them is going to underscore the need for democratic change and respect for human rights in Iran, which is a goal that I know all of you share. And if you watch the sweeping changes across the Arab world, when a fruit vendor's self-immolation in Tunisia sets off a wave of protest, anything can happen overnight. The people of Libya are still suffering under Muammar Gaddafi. The regimes of Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen continue to resist the march of history. And Iran remains locked in a time warp as well. And the failures of the regime in Tehran to live by the rules of the international community, its continued repression of democracy and the human rights of its people, stand as a real challenge, not just to those of you in this room, but to U.S. policies as well. Decades of our policies, sometimes isolations, other times outstretched hands, have simply failed to bring about fundamental change in this aging regime. Now, the United States faces not only the challenge of democracy and human rights in Iran, but also three other key challenges. First, Iran continues to support terrorist organizations that threaten our interests, including Hezbollah, Hamas, some of the Shia armed groups in Iraq. Second, it continues to seek a nuclear weapons. And third, Iran continues to undermine our efforts both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And largely of this agenda, the nuclear policy drives U.S. policy and much of the international community. And it's the nuclear agenda that has driven many of the failed efforts at engagement across both Democratic and Republican U.S. administrations. Iran's controversial nuclear and international efforts to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons to Iran is what dominates the broad international discussion on Iran. The recent IAEA report highlights both the concerns about Iran's weaponization activities and its technical difficulties. And earlier this month, there was a report on a panel of UN experts that declared that the multilateral sanctions adopted under UN Security Council resolution last year, strongly supported by the Obama administration, is having a significant impact on Iran's ability to proceed with its nuclear program. In other words, pressure works on this regime. It's clear that Iran is decision-making is guided by a clear cost-benefit analysis, and the more pressure we put on Iran, the more you're going to get results. And while we're pushing the Iranian agenda, I think the U.S. needs to stay focused on what we're all here today to talk about, which is the increasing repression in the Iranian regime, And Iran's repressive behavior, its nuclear program, its support for terrorism, undermining our interest in these regions are all directly related to the lack of democracy at home. They go hand in hand. And until that changes, until there is democratic change in Iran, the United States and our allies around the world will continue to face multiple threats from this regime. It will not change without a hand-in-hand democratic change. And a year and a half ago, before that young man set himself on fire in Tunisia, sparking that wave of protests, Iran's own protests surrounding the 2009 elections demonstrated the hopes and dreams of millions of Iranians and really captivated the world's attention. But as well as we all have seen, unlike in Tunisia and Egypt, the opposite happened in Iran, and the brutality is continuing against the protesters. You have friends and families and relatives who have been subject to not only imprisonment but execution as well. The government severely limits citizens' right to peacefully change their government through free and fair elections. It continues a campaign of post-election violence and intimidation. The government committed extrajudicial killings, executed persons, including juveniles, through unfair trials, sometimes group executions. Security forces under the government's control committed acts of politically motivated violence and repression, including torture, beatings, and rape. The government administered severe officially sanctioned punishments, including amputations and flogging. The list goes on. There are, at the end of last year, over 500 democracy activists and journalists in detention, in prison, and my guess is that number is on the low side. And some of you have experienced the brutality of this, not just during this 2009 election, but in years past. And this regime is still living in the 1970s. But the rest of the world is moving on into the 21st century, living up to standards of democracy and human rights. And while not anywhere near as strongly as we'd like, the international community is mounting increasing pressure on this regime. Earlier this year, the Human Rights Council at the UN, which just a short time ago was considered ineffective by some and an outlet for anti-Israeli rhetoric by others, did appoint an investigator for human rights violations in Iran. And that may not sound like a big step forward, but in the UN context, it's a monumental shift in their behavior. The UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said he was deeply troubled by reports of increased executions, amputations, arbitrary arrest and detention, unfair trials, possible torture and ill treatment of human rights activists, lawyers, journalists, and opposition activists. And this is a marked change in the international community's approach to trying to stand up to this regime that continues its repressive behavior. And the Arab Spring that's occurred throughout much of the Arab world has put a highlight the failure of the Iranian regime to change, and demonstrates yet again that it really is a relic of the past. Speaking at the U.S. Islamic World Forum, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton noted that Iran's leaders have consistently pursued policies of tyranny abroad and at home. And these actions have not been limited to those just inside Iran's borders as well. And we need to be vigilant of the Iranian activities outside of Iran as well. And particularly, I know many of you here are very concerned about the attacks on Camp Ashraf, particularly those last April. I think many of you have seen the brutal video footage of that assault, but we must never lose sight of the fact to stand up against these types of attacks. The responsibility of turning over the Camp Ashraf to the Iraqi government was conditional on Iraqi government assurances that the residents of the camp would remain protected. I know many of you here are deeply concerned about those in Camp Ashraf, but also very involved in the effort to push the U.S. government to delist the MEK from the State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism. And having worked closely in the Clinton administration with the peace process in Northern Ireland, and in the case of the MEK, you also face a government in Tehran that is providing zero democratic opening for change. Much easier with the Irish peace process when you had democratic governments both in Ireland and the UK willing to engage and give some political space. Within the US government, old habits die very, very hard as well. But the process of change is an essential change. It is essential that this process occur, especially now in the 20th century. I am confident the Obama administration's current review will be decided on the merits. I know many of you think that it's all a political process in the past, but having spoken to a variety of people in the administration, I do think this will be decided on the facts, and I think we'll have the review results this summer. So hopefully that will provide a new opening for all of you to have more engagement both here in the United States and abroad. In closing, let me just say that no one knows how fast the Iranian regime will change, but change will come. It's obvious that Iran is facing a split among its leadership, a long-brewing power struggle between President Ahmadinejad and the Supreme Leader Khomeini recently burst into public view over Ahmadinejad's decision to dismiss the intelligence minister, that the battle was over much more than just the intelligence ministry, and there are deeper issues at stake which are far from resolved. And this test of wills between the ruling clerical establishment and Ahmadinejad loyalists demonstrate how dysfunctional this system is. And the power struggle has left the Iranian president weakened and revealed many lessons about the strange political workings of this Islamic Republic. But the real battle in Iran is not within the regime, but between the regime and the brave young people who took to the streets in 2009 to demand a better leadership. No one knows how long it will take, but the forces of liberty are not on the side of this regime. And we all have an obligation to do more to support those who are struggling for freedom, not just in Tunis and Cairo and the streets of Tripoli, but on the streets of Tehran as well. And I commend you for your efforts to bring about that change. Thank you.
In several countries in the Middle East, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, in Bahrain, the United States has been struggling to identify and to support people and forces that stand for democratic reform, that want to introduce systems of governance in their countries that will pursue the welfare of their citizens. And what has been the response of the mullahs in Iran to these historic events going on around them? Well, for one thing, Iran has provided help to the worst elements in the Middle East, not only to Hamas and Hezbollah. It has actually provided the Assad regime with snipers who have helped that regime terrorize and murder its own citizens. Domestically, the Iranian regime in 2011 alone has hanged almost 150 people whose only crime was to oppose repression. In the 1990s, as a goodwill gesture to the regime in Tehran, our government placed the MEK on that list. By all accounts, this was done so as to help us engage with the regime in Tehran and perhaps get that regime to behave as a responsible member of the world community. Whether that policy was wise or foolish, there's no mistaking that it failed. Repeatedly, the Iranian regime has grown only more hostile and more threatening toward the United States and toward its neighbors. In the administration in which I served, that designation was continued, this time out of fear that if MEK were delisted, the Iranians would provide weapons, including deadly IEDs, to insurgents in Iraq. This policy, too, was a failure, because although the designation continued, Iran supplied deadly weapons, including IEDs, to those insurgents. Today, and for years before today, MEK stands explicitly for establishing a democratic, non-nuclear, secular republic in Iran. Its members who live in Iraq and Camp Ashraf have given up the weapons they might have used to defend themselves and put their welfare in the hands of coalition forces after the 2003 invasion of Iraq. They accepted the solemn assurances of the coalition, and specifically of American generals, that they would be treated as protected persons under international law. In addition to accepting the word of our military that residents of Ashraf would be protected, the MEK took to our courts to undo the unjust designation by resorting to the law. So in July of 2010, the MEK won a ruling from the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit that the Secretary of State must reconsider the designation of MEK as a foreign terrorist organization because the information she was relying on to continue that designation was not sufficient. And where do we stand today? Well, in Camp Ashraf, the organization that surrendered its arms and placed itself under international protection in 2003, to the point where the residents of Ashraf each received an identification card like this, like the one I'm holding up, designating them as protected persons under international law, has been attacked twice by Iraqi troops, once in July of 2009, once in April of 2011. At both times when our Secretary of Defense was present in Iraq. The last time resulting in the murder of 35 defenseless women and men with weapons and vehicles supplied by the United States, operated by troops trained by the United States, and the United States has done nothing about it. In fact, although the attack came from Iraqi troops who were photographed in the act of committing it, some in the State Department have actually advocated resettling Ashraf residents elsewhere in Iraq, away from the Iranian border, as if the attack somehow had come from Iran. A sure way of making certain that the remaining residents of Ashraf could be obliterated completely out of the sight of the rest of the world. And what about the listing of MEK, which the Secretary of State was ordered in July of 2010 to reconsider? Well, 10 months later, that review has not been completed, and the State Department has offered no estimate of when it might be completed. Most recently, the State Department has purported to release from the allegedly classified record 10 documents that contain absolutely no information that is either new or relevant, and have questioned MEK representatives about all manner of irrelevancies. Let us take one example that I think lifts the lid off what is going on here. An unclassified State Department document reporting that when State Department officials questioned Iranians applying for visas to enter the United States from such places as Ankara, Baku, Berlin, Dubai, and Istanbul, these visa applicants reported that they regarded the MEK unfavorably. Now think about that. First of all, whether these Iranians think well or ill of MEK is not relevant to whether MEK should be listed as a foreign terrorist organization. But beyond that, the State Department is actually claiming with a straight face that when it lists MEK as a foreign terrorist organization and then asks people applying for visas what they think of MEK, the people they ask who are applying for visas to the country that lists MEK as a foreign terrorist organization say they hold unfavorable views toward MEK. A first-year college student who offered that kind of evidence to support a conclusion in a term paper would get an F. In other words, the State Department is engaged in a strategy of endless delay. Why? It is possible that a clue to the explanation lies in what happened in Libya, when France sent a warship and the United States sent a ferry boat that could not even depart when the sea was rough, and government officials explained that we did not want to act boldly so long as there were Americans in Libya. There are, as we know, 2 American students being held by Iran on trumped-up charges that they were spying. Is that it? I would suggest that perhaps a congressional hearing called by the House Foreign Affairs Committee could get to the bottom of it quickly. Whatever the reason, it's long past time for this country to act based on its principles, to delist MEK and thereby encourage those in Iran who are struggling for regime change, and to make certain that the residents of Ashraf are either permitted to remain where they are, with security provided by an international force, or that they are permitted to leave Iraq for other countries. The United States did not achieve greatness by taking the counsel of its fears, but rather by drawing inspiration from its ideals. It's time for the United States not only to be a great power, but also to act like one. Thank you very much.
And I think that it's important that in the context of the very profound observations that have been made by the panelists today, that we rethink a little bit how the world is. My first fact of life is the world is a sorry mess. I don't care where you go and look. Every day you pick up the newspaper. No place seems to be better off. Maybe Tunisia, I might give you that. But the rest of the world, you take a look around, things are sort of going downhill slowly, economically, security-wise, stability-wise. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. I think that our problem is not our capabilities. Our problem is our policies and our will to use those capabilities. And it's that uncertainty is causing us to needlessly lose, I think, clout on a global basis. There has been another good piece of good news, and it's very important. I think you know this as well as I. And that is there has been movement on the MEK problem because of Camp Ashraf and what happened there. That was not in vain. Things are happening. They're happening too slowly. We don't have the full answers, but as you've heard others say, and I would confirm, that first of all, there are more people who understand what happened now. There are more people focused on this question about what is happening to the MEK. There is a question about who is going to be the protectorate of the MEK in the days ahead. And then there is a more basic question about who is going to lead to the question as we approach the December deadline of what happens to the camp. So this is a good area in the sense of we are getting people to recognize there's an issue, congressmen are paying attention, people in the State Department are paying attention, and there are people who are involved with the responsibility of dealing with this problem who are beginning to deal with it. That is good news, and you should get some credit for that, and I readily give it to you. I want to go back to this atmosphere of uncertainty because I do feel it's very important that we understand that we need to make decisions in government. It's what we get paid to do. I ask these following questions quite often to audiences. Are we at war? How many people in this room think the United States of America is at war? That's usually the answer I get. It's usually split. In fact, we are at war, but there's not a lot of people who think so. And if we are at war, actually, who is the enemy? And if we are at war and we are questioning who's the enemy, we have to ask, where's the battlefield? Is it just Iraq? Is it just Iraq and Afghanistan? Or is there another battlefield as well? Do we pay any attention to the fact there's domestic terrorism and that people are trying to blow up airplanes or Times Square or Fort Hood or whatever it might be? So if we recognize we are at war, we recognize that there is an enemy, we recognize that some of them are here among us, the next question is, well, what are the rules of engagement? Is this something for the police department? Do you call 911? Or do we actually employ some kind of a military force and an intelligence force to deal with this threat to our security, which is now among us? The next question you always ask about a war is, are we winning? The next question you ask is, how do you define winning? What is winning in the war that we're fighting right now? And when you get through all of this and you look at the fact that there are more UBLs out there, just taking out Osama bin Laden didn't do it, There's a new list out today of 5 new UBLs that we're going after in the war, and there'll be 5 more after them, because we're not going to run out of them in any time soon. The hallmark response, in my view, has been that this indecision in how to deal with this and answer these questions about war to the understanding of our allies and our enemies on a global basis is very important. And you take a quick look, we've had a tour of the Arab Spring. We've had Professor Tanner say that the Mideast, the Near East is a boil. It is. And this big problem that we are concerned about with Iran is, will the Arab Spring become a nuclear winter because Iran gets the weapon? And that is something that Mr. Eisenstadt, I think, brilliantly stated for us. It is a huge concern. Now, going forth and taking a look briefly around some of the Arab countries, we look at Libya. Libya, to me, is a template for a day late and a dollar short. We are tiptoeing our way into Libya. We're trying to say, okay, we want a humanitarian relief. But of course, we're also saying out of the side of our mouth, what we really want is regime change, but we're not going to put ground troops in there because we don't want a war with Libya. We're not going to go that far. So we're trying to get it both ways. And probably what's going to happen in Libya is, how much money is it going to take to buy off Gaddafi? That's really the bottom line, I think, before we get through. We go to areas like Yemen. Now, if Gaddafi is so bad, then what about the expression of people in Yemen today who don't like President Saleh either? What do we do about President Saleh, and what do we do about Yemen? I mean, we've got a lot of problems there in a sort of a critical place in terms of oil shipment and other things. We don't want another failed state which becomes a sanctuary for terrorists. It happens that Yemen is a place where they do some very serious terrorist training. You go on to President Mubarak. We've talked about the Egyptian situation, very beautifully presented. The question I'd ask you is, what comes after Mubarak, and is it better or worse? I don't know. None of us know the answer to that question yet, but shouldn't we know the answer to that question, and shouldn't we be ahead of that curve? I think the answer is yes. We talk about Syria. Obviously, Syria is a puppet for Iran in so much mischief. And we take a look at the brutality that's happening there. Having snipers taking innocent people out is insane. Basically, you've got a very weak guy in Assad who is surrounded by a bunch of bad actors who are pushing him around. Not a good formula for getting a positive result at all. So we've got some serious heavy lifting. But when it comes to Iran, which is the #1 most serious problem, and here is why I would say that. First of all, our stated objectives in Iran are regime change. Everybody has said that since President Clinton and before, actually. Nuclear nonproliferation is a critical factor. How are we doing on that? Not so well. You read the papers. This is not an intelligence revelation. You read the papers, you've been discovering they're cheating. Oh, no. They're actually using all those techniques and mechanics, and they're actually building a weapon over there. And even though we're negotiating, every day we negotiate, they get more capability, and we make less progress. So we're not doing so well on the proliferation, the non-proliferation. And in the area of exporting mischief, does anybody seriously think that Iran is exporting less mischief today through Hezbollah or the relationships in Syria or any place else taking advantage of this Arab Spring that we've already heard about? So I would say that we are not doing as well as we should be doing at all in this sort of brief tour that I've given you. Now, when we talk about our policy today, I am not talking about the British fleet on the Potomac River and the British Army climbing up the stairs of the White House with lit torches a couple hundred years ago. I'm not talking about defending the homeland. I'm talking about the policy of how we employ our national security capabilities in a global world as it exists today. And that gets into questions like preventing regional instability, preventing disruption of commerce, championing the oppressed, aiding the freedom seekers, stopping nuclear proliferators and regimes who are actively providing lethal aid and materials against our troops overseas? These are the kinds of questions where we have to ask ourselves, can just negotiation do a trick, or do we need to deploy some force, some kind of force or persuasion that goes beyond just normal, old-school diplomatic negotiation? I think that the question that comes to mind most for me, other than the recent Camp Ashraf situation, I was looking into the history of our acting on humanitarian causes. And it's interesting that there's a lot of always humanitarian causes out there. The globe is a sorry place, as I say. We've got Darfur, where we did something, Libya, where we're around the edges, sort of. Rwanda comes to mind. And if you deal with the kind of genocide that took place in Rwanda, and you're thinking about human rights and so forth, you think, my gosh, is there any excuse for us sitting on our hands during that terrible event when 400,000 to 500,000 people, ethnic tribes people, got murdered? The answer is, if that isn't a trigger for the United States of America to do something, then what is the line? What is the line we use to make a decision? Do our policymakers use? Now, if it's an oppressed nation, who makes the decision about how to relieve the oppression so that the people in that nation can express themselves in a way that will affect regime change? Can you actually do that? So that gets to my second question. Okay, let's suppose we want regime change. We all agree. We go all around, and all the players say, yep, bad guy needs to get out of there. So how do you do that? I mean, you've got to have some way to make that happen. Now, I know that the negotiations, use of force, you have presented a third way, which I think is obviously a very sensible, appropriate way to proceed, of letting the people express themselves and take it over and do the job. My worry there is always, how much is it going to cost? Already, we've had freedom fighters we've seen in my lifetime in Hungary, and since then many times in many places, who have gone out and done the demonstration, done the hard work, and been repressed again, but have sent the message to the world that they need help. They want people behind them to assume the freedoms they look for. These questions of what you employ to get regime change are unanswered. Now, I am not advocating targeted assassinations of leaders we do not like. That's a lousy game to start. It's a slippery slope, and you go downhill. But I am saying, in places where our national security is threatened, or where real genocide is going on, we have capabilities that we can use effectively to take the mischief makers out of the program. And I think that is an area that we need to spend more time focusing on. You hope that in most situations that won't happen. But it is important to know that the United States of America, because it has had to develop that capabilities to protect itself, has indeed protected itself and will continue to protect itself against the UBLs and anybody else of that ilk who want to do us and all Americans harm. We're in a position today where we can do something if we only will. We can't kick down the situation on the MEK anymore, or on Camp Ashraf. We're running out of time. We've got a deadline coming up. We know that we can count on other international organizations to help somewhat, but when you get down to it, the real force, the real factor, the real pusher and shover is going to be the United States of America. And that's why we have to encourage our Department of State to come up with the answers on what they are going to do to finish this review. As I say, you've given them a lot to think about. You've given them a third way to proceed towards removing what I would say is an autocratic theocracy of people who are certainly opposing anything like a free democratic republic. And I also would say that we are owed an explanation by both the Department of State and by President Maliki on what actually happened at Camp Ashraf. I'm not satisfied I understand that. I think that we need more assurances of what is going to happen in terms of protection as we proceed, and then, of course, the final justice. Who leads us to the relocation? Who is the individual? Who is the country? What is the mechanism that takes us to the relocation? We're running out of time for that answer. That has to happen very quickly. And finally, I would say this. A colleague of mine in Congress now said that one of the failures of the United States of America in the last century, late last century, when we were beginning to understand terrorism and this autocratic, despotic leadership that was taking hold in some places, it's because we did not ID the implacable fanatics who are out there. And these are people who are openly committed to our destruction, and I would suggest that we learn something, that an enemy who wants to kill you is not an enemy that you can negotiate with. Thank you very much.
And the policy issues I dealt with were fundamentally about geopolitical power and security issues, very traditionally defined, and more specifically about the balance of power in the Gulf. But let me say here at the outset that though even if I weren't a security professional, I still think that the U.S. as a whole needs to measure and evaluate its Iran policy against the standard of how it is dealing with Iran as a strategic challenge. I believe this is the most important prism, although not the only one, by which to frame and judge our Iran policies. I believe this approach, which has been tried periodically over the past 20 years or so when in vogue, has not advanced U.S. policy aims over the past few decades, nor has it seemed to help the cause of freedom and prosperity in Iran. Now, this is not to say that Iran is just a security problem for the U.S. with military solutions. The relationship, the region, and what is at stake is far too complex for that. However, I put small hope in traditional diplomatic engagement or outreach to this Iranian regime. However, let me make a non-political military point directly up front and then circle back to it in my conclusion to underscore the relationship between different elements of American power. And here's the point. There is nothing that is likely to be more decisive and more influential in reducing the strategic threats from Iran's current regime than having a vigorous democratic opposition within Iran. It should be a central goal of U.S. policy to support the democratic opposition in Iran, and the U.S. should be prepared to do so with as much aid as is required and without any concessions to the Iranian regime. We've seen both before and during the Ahmadinejad presidency that we get precious little in return for appeasing the current Iranian government. Military might, strategic postures, security agreements, intelligence activities, and all those other tools of my profession aside, I'm telling you that the single most telling strategic lever we have against this Iranian regime is a well-organized and legitimate democratic opposition that has the muscular support of both the U.S. and Europe. But first, let me touch on the important strategic issues in my field. It's very useful to recognize that since the end of World War II, it has been an important, if not a vital, American interest to preserve a balance of power in the Gulf. And when I served in government, we recognized that since the revolution in Iran, there had only been two real counterweights to Iranian pressure, hegemonic ambitions, and revolutionary export, and that was Iraq and the U.S. Saddam's Iraq as a local geopolitical counterweight to Iran for many years was not in any doubt. It's not a value judgment, it's just a fact. Now, when the U.S. removed Saddam from power in 2003, the U.S. was left as the only geopolitical counterweight to Iran. And despite the huge amount of American forces we had in the region, the notion by 2004, 2005, 2006 that the U.S. was tied down in a very tough period in Iraq, Iranian attempts to exert active military or paramilitary influence through Shiite factions in Iraq and Hezbollah in Lebanon, especially during the 2006 war, an Iranian charm offensive with its Arab neighbors, and the self-perception of the Arab countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council of their own military weaknesses in key areas left the regional balance of power more fragile than we would have liked. But what we really needed, given where Iranian pressure was an updated policy that took into account less obvious, but perhaps more insidious ways of threatening a neighbor or undermining their freedom of action. nuclear bullying, terrorism, harassment, fomenting internal problems, and the like. But Iran remains an enormous strategic challenge to regional and even global stability. If this particular Iranian regime is left unchecked in its nuclear ambitions, unchecked in its ambitions to destabilize the region through proxy organizations, unchecked in its support for terrorism or in exporting its revolutionary theocratic fervor, then the Gulf region and by extension the world has a very big problem. So looking at this whole situation, as U.S. and even European policymakers look at all their options, they have to examine their entire kit bag of tools. And diplomatic pressure from the UN and the major powers, including sanctions, has had some effect, but I think we all have to recognize it has not fundamentally changed the behavior of the regime or aided regime change. Military options from the U.S. and the coalition forces in the region are very extensive, and much could be done militarily to pressure the regime well short of anything resembling an invasion or even a limited incursion against Iran. However, and here is where the explicit goals of your organizations and U.S. security aims coincide, a potent democratic opposition in Iran that has the unified support of Europe and the U.S. is a key element. Now, all these elements of policy should be seen as synergistic and part and parcel of one goal, to see a free and peaceable democratic Iran replace a belligerent and militant theocracy. A free, peaceful, and non-nuclear Iran will be able to say goodbye to military confrontations with the U.S. and its neighbors, international sanctions, and the like. And I hope that the democratic opposition in Iran can make this point known to and accepted by their supporters. Now, the U.S. and its coalition partners have a mighty military force in the Gulf region. Aircraft carriers will not win this confrontation. At the end of the day, political military arrangements in the region and even more effective diplomatic pressure or sanctions by themselves cannot bring peace to the region, and certainly not freedom and prosperity to the Iranian people. Yes, there was a Persian Spring before this current Arab Spring. We need those forces to be aided, inspired, and supported as a central tenet of U.S. and European policy. Thank you very much.
I'm Raymond Tanter. I served in the Reagan-Bush administration on the National Security Council staff, taught at the University of Michigan, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Northwestern University, and now at Georgetown University teaching terrorism and proliferation. And I follow with great interest the idea of a new Middle Eastern initiative and the policy on Iran. And it seems as if in the Middle East right now, turmoil abounds. And there's an increased focus on the political opposition. When I served on the NSC staff, I thought maybe this is a good time to start thinking about regime change in authoritarian places. And my colleague said, look, these are our friends. And I said, but they won't last long. Well, one of the countries I focused on at the time was Libya, and Gaddafi lasted from quite some time, but he will not last much longer. Henry Kissinger once said to me that if you get into a debate, only tell about that debate if you won the debate. Well, I've been on MSNBC and CNN and a couple of other channels with Nancy Soderberg, and she won all the debates, I'm very displeased to say. Nancy Soderberg has probably won every debate she has held, including when she was on the John Daly Show. And at that time, she anticipated the developments that we're seeing today, and that people power would begin to change the regimes. And this was in 2006. She's a very prophetic person in that respect. And in the last few minutes here we have together, I would like to close with some remarks. As a professor, I have the right to talk about research, right? So let's talk quickly about research that will, I think, add some or shed some light on the review process that Ambassador Soderberg and others have discussed going on at the State Department. Point of view of research, there's not much to sustain the merits of the case about which both Ambassador Eisenstadt and Ambassador Soderberg mentioned. That's one of the implications of being on the Foreign Terrorist Organization list, is that it criminalizes contact with with individuals who are members of a designated organization. And UNAMI oversight, monitoring activity can go forth. And that's why it's very important to keep a residual American force and as well keep UNAMI invested as a stakeholder in monitoring the human rights of the people of Ashraf. Mr. Crowley said that now is the time to make some changes, and I would say this reminds me of what Rabbi Hillel said, if not now, when, if not us, who, now is the time.
Thank you, sir.